Hello, hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Tiny Fit Diva podcast. I'm your host, Kylene Terhune, functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner. It's my job to help you uncover the hidden causes of chronic health conditions so that you can sleep better, have more energy, and live an optimally healthy life. On that road, I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Kendra Becker. She is an integrated physician practicing for over 10 years. She holds an ND degree and an MS APRN. Her specialties include MTHFR, which is a gene, fertility and treatment of the 4 A's, asthma, autism, allergies, and is it atopy? Atopy? I wasn't sure how to pronounce that.
Yeah, atopy.
Atopy. Dr. Becker lectures all over the country on topics such as autism, the immune system, MTHFR, and genetic mutations that have health implications, and keeping healing in the home. Dr. Becker is the author of A Delicious Way to Heal the Gut, and just recently she released her second book, All You Can Eat, which I like the emphasis on can, because when we're on our health journey, a lot of times it's easy to focus on what we cannot eat. So awesome title. Love that. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I do have to tell you, I named it for my husband because I always tell the story. He went to chiropractic school when I was in naturopathic school. It's where we met. And so you can't treat your relatives. We were already engaged. He came into the clinic and I had him see one of the clinic clinicians in there who was like, you got to get rid of this and you got to get rid of balsamic vinegar. Well, he was wearing a white t-shirt that day and he walked out. He was in a cold sweat, like his t-shirt was soaked. And all he could focus on was these like 5 foods that he couldn't eat. You know, and it's so funny because over the years, you see that over and over again. Like nobody looks at the tens of thousands of foods that you can eat, but they focus on the 5 foods that they can't. So that was the backstory.
That's so funny because, yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right in terms of the number. Like we will stress out about 1, 2, 3, 5 things. Mm-hmm. And in reality, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other foods that you can eat. And I love that focus because I try to do that with my clients as well. I will work with some autoimmune clients. And so I'm sure you know that autoimmune protocol diet is very restrictive. And so there is a lot of foods, way more than 5 foods that you have to eliminate in order to really discover what works for your body when it's that sensitive.
Yep.
And so what's great about that protocol though, is it also really does focus on bringing nutrient dense foods in. And so there's tons of lists of foods that you can eat and try to get more of this and try to get more of that, experiment with these vegetables. And so it's a really good perspective to have. I think when you have those lists, it's way easier to just sort of go into it calmly, look at it as an adventure, try new things. What good food can I try today? My husband and I would sometimes go into like Whole Foods and we would stand in the produce department and we'd look around and be like, okay, what do we not know? What have we never tried before? And then you go home and you have to Google like how to make it. But it works because then you're like, oh my gosh, I've never tried leeks before and they taste amazing and they make a great soup and all this kind of stuff. So that's really cool. So share a little bit about your journey. Who are you? Where are you from? How did you get into this world?
So I actually have a really interesting story. I went to college to become a nurse, and I was going to be the next Florence Nightingale. Like I totally owned that. Well, except for I graduated in the largest nursing glut in recorded history in the late 90s. So there I was in Boston and I couldn't get arrested as a nurse. I could work 3 different per diem jobs and get paid a really nice salary, but I couldn't get anybody to really train me a unit. I could never find a unit to call my home. And so I ended up applying to 17 hospitals on the West Coast. I mean, I was like 22 years old. What did I care? I was going to go to California. So I applied to 17 hospitals on the West Coast and 1 responded to me. And the reason that they did is because they had a nurse from my program who they were very impressed with. So they picked my resume out of a lineup and basically I did telephone interviews and was hired on the spot, never saw the hospital. Flew out there, went into a critical care unit. So I was trained as a brand new grad in the ICU, which was really unusual at the time, and loved it. I mean, I worked in a unit that had amazing teamwork. I worked with pediatrics and adults in cardiac surgery and really loved that job for like 5 years. But what ended up happening is as, California was the first state to really roll out HMO medicine. So as medicine kind of eroded, you could see it in the ICU. So what would happen is patients would come up on the floor and they would be chest pain, rule out MI, and you would get their admission paperwork. And then as the paperwork is coming over on the fax, I know I'm dating myself here, the discharge paperwork would come over on the fax. Nobody ever saw these patients. And so it was the same horrible care: chest pain, rule out MI, cardiac cath, clean coronaries, purple pill, basically I'll see you in 3 months. And nobody ever got to the root of their illness. And what was interesting for me is the things that I learned, because I was still in nursing at a time where you really could talk to patients and really lay your hands on them. Like these patients that had open heart surgery, I mean, many of them had profound losses. They were World War II vets, or they had lost children in their lives. I mean, it's no wonder why it affected their heart. And, nobody takes the time to do that anymore. So, I was in a unit that, had really great, we had technological, advancements like before our eyes. We worked with cutting edge doctors, and I was like, I'm done. And I literally, left the job. I gave 2 weeks notice and quit, and relocated back to the East Coast to start naturopathic school. And so that was kind of the end of it. In San Diego, I was in San Diego. So in San Diego, it's easy.
That's so funny, because I feel like San Diego is more like natural, holistic. You have so much access over there now. So there must have been a big shift.
There was a huge shift. And it's like when you really start looking at it, and here I was, I'd spend 12 hours in the hospital, like eating protein bars and drinking water, only so I could hurry up and get out so I could go for a run on the beach, or I could take a 30-mile bike ride. And I'm like, the focus is so out of balance. You know what I mean? And it was so easy when I really started to look around that the focus was on health. And, I had both of my grandmothers were immigrants. One was from Italy and one was from Austria. And it was like, this was always the practical medicine. Like, one used to give us chicken soup for everything that was wrong. And the other one would be like, oh, you have an itch or a scratch, go to the garden and get some comfrey. We'll make some tea and put it on your boo-boo. It was like always so practical. And it wasn't until I'd started naturopathic school to realize that, like, I remember my grandmother said to me, you need a degree for that? And I was like, yeah, actually you do. So it's always been there. And so then I graduated from naturopathic school in 2005, married my husband while we were in school. He graduated as a chiropractor, and we opened a practice together. And I was the 64th or so practicing naturopath in the state of Connecticut. So can you imagine, like, you go from being a nurse, where you're out socially and people are like, oh, what do you do? I'm a nurse. And then the conversation is, my mom's a nurse, my sister's a nurse, blah, 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 to being a naturopath, to what is that exactly?
Yeah.
So there was a lot of that as far as, a social learning curve. And, about 6, and then I had 2 kids of my own. And about 6 years ago, I really kind of went super narrow and super deep into the genetics. It just seemed to make a lot of practical sense for me. And even though up to that point, my practice was almost exclusively pediatrics, what's happened over the last 6 or so years is it's really kind of evolved, where the children always come in first, but the parents then realize that the genes came from the parents. And in many cases, I have the good fortune of also seeing the grandparents. So, to be able to see 3 generations of the same family, I mean, the impact that you can have as a provider is absolutely incredible. So for me right now, my practice is exactly what I would want it to be.
That's so cool. Who gets to do 3 generations? Even 2 generations. I mean, that's amazing. And I was just talking to Erica Gray at Toolbox Genomics. I don't know if you know her. And she was talking. Yeah, and she was talking about, genetically speaking, how it passes on to your kids and to your grandkids, and different things in your life, and different habits that you have, and different life experiences and stress and trauma and all this kind of stuff. And so to be able to reach multiple generations individually yourself, that's just incredible, because you're impacting the next 2 or 3 generations. That's so cool.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So cool. So you did start with pediatrics, and you focused on, or you specialized in the 4 A's. Can you explain that really quickly?
Sure. So the 4 A's are, like you had mentioned earlier, asthma, autism, allergy, and atopy. Okay. So even though they're different diagnosable conditions, basically the mechanism is the same, and it comes from the gut. And so that had really always been my focus. And then as I kind of got into the genetics, there are huge genetic and epigenetic modulators to those 4 conditions. And so, the big joke in the office is I could have 10 kids in the waiting room that have autism that are on 10 different treatment protocols, or 10 different kids with 10 different diagnoses that are on the same protocol. So it all depends on really what you're seeing with the patient. And I think that's really where holistic medicine excels, is that individual aspect to treatment, and the fact that really the healing is in the hands of the patient. I talked to a patient this morning, and all the stuff that she had come in here for, and she was basically debilitated and bedridden, and we had kind of resolved the bulk of her symptoms. And so she said, "Thank you so much for helping me." And I was like, I really didn't do anything other than guide your treatment. I mean, you're the one that exercised the way I recommended, and you're the one that ate the way I recommended and took the supplements that I recommended. I mean, the healing was on you, really.
I love that. The healing is in the hands of the patient. That's a tweetable. That's a quote. Hashtag.
Absolutely.
It's so true, though. I mean, it's funny because it's almost like sometimes, and not always, but sometimes it's the most basic information. And you hand it to someone and you say, "Here, take it." And 9 out of 10 people won't do it, and so they don't see any results. And then there's that one person that takes it, breathes it, absorbs it, lives it, comes back to you like in 2 weeks, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, my life is changed." And you're like, "I literally didn't do anything except tell you the direction to go. You did it." It's amazing. I love that. I love that.
Absolutely.
So you just sort of naturally got into epigenetics because you realized that was beyond gut health, which we talk a lot about on this show. That's sort of my focus. That's what I love to learn about, to talk about. You ended up discovering that there's a lot of genetic tendencies in plays and how we can affect those. So can you talk about that? Let's talk about epigenetics. What is epigenetics? Can you go into that really quickly?
So epigenetics is basically the environment's influence on the genes that God gave you. And, I always give my my story is really interesting in this regard. I have 2 children, but before my first child was born, my daughter, I had 2 late miscarriages. I was in naturopathic school. I read all the research at the time. When you're positive for MTHFR, like I was, the research stated that we give 5 milligrams of folic acid, which we now know is synthetic. I took 5 milligrams of folic acid and I lost 2 babies. And it was right around that time after my second miscarriage, before my daughter was born, that all that research came out that said folic acid is synthetic. We think it causes cancer. We're kind of sorry that we recommended it all these years. Change, love, forgive, take some methylfolate and you have a lovely day. And so I changed my prenatal that I was taking, and lo and behold, I got pregnant and had a healthy baby girl, and 3 years later had a healthy baby boy. And so that was kind of like my aha moment, that we really have to look not only at the genetics, which I'd been treating for almost a decade at that point, but we also have to look at the epigenetics, because look what we did with folic acid alone. Can you imagine? Like, we need to look at what we're doing with pollution and what we're doing with GMOs and EMFs and all these things that people can be really genetically susceptible to. And so the beauty of the testing that we're doing now through any one of these wonderful companies gives us an idea or a more precision direction to go in, to be able to help patients say, "Hey, you know what? You should not live on a golf course where there are lots of pesticides and chemicals, because you have PON1. PON1 is a gene that helps our bodies detox chemicals and pesticides. So if somebody expresses their PON1, they're not doing that very well. So you can, there's genes that show susceptibility to things like Wi-Fi or different chemicals or anesthesias or pharmaceuticals. And so you can take a look with your patients, at very specific genetics to see if there's something in their genetic predisposition that we could support so that they can live the healthiest life possible based on their environment. Or they can make changes in their environment to be able to support their genetics.
So in terms of flipping that switch where you have a gene, but that's the caution that a lot of functional medicine practitioners really tell people is, hey, you can get genetic testing, but don't freak out. Just because you have a gene doesn't necessarily mean it's activated or turned on. So how do you know if a gene is activated or not? Is it purely like the symptomology of it, where you're noticing like, okay, this gene helps you detoxify and those are the symptoms you've been having, so clearly it's activated? Or is there another way? Like, is there a test that shows you? Like, how do you know?
So, well, I always say, your genes do not define you. The genetics load the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. So yes, for me, I generally, I tend to be really, naturopathic, forgive the pun in this regard, in the sense that I always treat my patient. Lab work is a guideline, genetic testing is a guideline. And basically, know if the genes are expressing themselves by either, correlating them with lab work or correlating them with symptom picture. Now, having that be said, if genes are turned on or turned off, or you have a genetic predisposition to certain genes, those are things that we can kind of ward off, like for example, the COMT gene, which has a higher predisposition for leaky gut, has a higher predisposition for estrogen dominance. And so those are genes that if somebody's got and it's positive, so they have some sort of a mutation, it's generally a conversation that I will have with a patient about that. And, a really good example is I had this beautiful family come in the office. They had this little boy with blonde hair and blue eyes, and the husband was handsome and the wife was gorgeous, and they were like this beautiful family. And I sat on the couch, and I have the kids' genetics, and I've never seen the family before, but they did the genetics before they came in the office. And so I'm looking at it, and I said, who has the history of pancreatitis? So the wife points to the husband. Who has the history of migraine? The husband points to the wife. And I'm like, where's the sensitivity to vaccines? And they both point to the kid. So there is definitely some genetics that you can kind of read, and you kind of feel a little bit like a psychic, because you have the information in front of them. And it's a really interesting position to be in, because it doesn't define you, but it can let you know, or let me know as the physician, where the weak spots are, so you can just support those patients in really, really natural, healthy ways.
So I don't know if this really matters or not. Is it easier to prevent a gene from being activated, so to speak, or is it just as easy once it's activated to shut it off, to reverse it?
Depends on the person, depends on the gene, right? But like I always tell my patients, I have no amount of supplements or blood work that is ever going to replace a healthy diet, good sleep, good exercise, and being kind. End of story.
I love that addition.
Yeah.
And being kind. Your emotional and mental energy plays a huge part.
Huge. And my grandmother, I saw her genetics before she died. She lived to be 96 years old. She had 4 babies. She was married for 70 something years. She died with all of her teeth. You know what I mean? And her genetics were horrendous, but she was an Italian immigrant that walked every day, and she was the same weight that she was the day she died as she was the day she graduated from high school. So you know what I mean? What we do in our lives and what we do in our environment has a huge impact on what our genes look like. And we've only had this technology, maybe 15 years tops. So I don't know that it should really change our treatment protocol. What it should do is it should be like the icing on your cupcake. It's just more additional information that gives us power to live the best lives we can live.
I love that. The icing on the cupcake. It's so true. I just recently got the 23andMe, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting. It doesn't change a whole lot. It just is more information. And what's really interesting about the 23andMe, I'm sure there's tons of other tests that people can get, and there's probably different tests that different providers prefer. But that one gives you raw data. So if you do have somebody that is more educated and can take a look at that, you can actually look at a lot of different genes that 23andMe doesn't specifically list out for you and tell you about. They just sort of pull ones out, I think, that they either you're going to have a problem with, or they think that you might be interested in. So I'm curious to find maybe a resource where I can get the raw data and look at more of the stuff. But yeah, it's a fascinating field for sure. And then what's more interesting than even knowing your genes, though, is knowing exactly what you're talking about, that your environment, your mentality, your food, your mood, all these things can affect your genes. So let's talk a little bit about symptoms or diseases that may be connected. I think it was actually on your blog. So I was looking at your blog today or yesterday, where there was a connection, or we need to be aware of MTHFR in relation to Down syndrome. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, that was a recent study, within the last year. So it's funny, I have several children with Down syndrome in my practice, and only about 50% of them actually have MTHFR. So my N of 1, my practice doesn't correlate with what that study stated. So that study, I think, was done outside of the country. I think it was done in Australia, if I'm not mistaken. And it showed that women at a very high incidence, something I want to say close to 90%, that were positive for MTHFR had a very, very high correlation of having children with Down syndrome. And the mechanism
of having children with Down syndrome. Oh, that's fascinating.
Yes.
Okay.
So what's interesting is, what I extrapolated from that is it makes perfect sense, right? Because if you're positive for MTHFR and that gene is expressing, it's basically a gene for inflammation, right? So it codes for an enzyme that is part of the methylation pathway. Methylation is part of detox. So if you're not methylating or detoxing properly, what are you doing? You're basically creating inflammation. And so what they've correlated with Down syndrome is what happens with that 21st chromosome is it's sticky, right? That's why you end up with a third one. And so when you think about inflammation, you think about things being sticky. So that's kind of how I drew the mental picture. But when you look at what is on chromosome 21, 50% of the genes that code for our immune system are on chromosome 21. Right? So if you're, have Down syndrome and are also positive for MTHFR, you really have an immune system that is grossly impaired. 50% of your genes are either impaired or absent, and then you're positive for MTHFR, so you can't even move the toxicity through the body very quickly. So it makes perfect sense why the Down syndrome population should be the cleanest of the eaters and have the cleanest environments and really stay far, far away from as many medical procedures as possible, because their bodies are just not equipped to be able to eliminate any of the toxicity that they could be exposed to.
Really, really interesting.
Yeah.
So I didn't hear that. When I was looking through it, I don't think I saw the part where it was from the mother, but I was seeing some correlation with struggles that people that have the MTHFR gene have in relation to, in correlation with Down syndrome patients and the struggles that they have in terms of vision and things like that, that a lot of people that have MTHFR struggle with a lot of the same things that Down syndrome people would also struggle with. So I thought that was a really interesting piece of information.
Absolutely. I think it translates far greater than what we even are really connecting in modern science at this point. I totally agree. And it's the same thing too. There's a lot of anatomical similarities with kids that are positive for Down or that have autism that also have Down syndrome. I mean, you're still looking at SOD enzymes. You're still looking at impaired detox. You're looking at boosting and balancing the immune system. So there is a lot of correlation for sure.
So I'm curious what your perspective would be on this. So I think that just sort of my observations and the little bit that I know about this stuff, it seems like there are general rules, right? There's general rules for what is and is not healthy. Like if we really boil it down, we know that eating whole foods is better than eating a Pop-Tart, for example, right? We know that getting good sleep is better than running on 3 to 4 hours. We know that having natural energy is better than chugging the caffeine. We know these things. Like intrinsically, if we're honest with ourselves, we know those things. But the reason I think so many people can get away with it is because they do have the ability to detox, or they do have good genes, or whatever it is. And so when I look at people with chronic disease or chronic health struggles, and maybe their genes are expressing a certain way, to me it's like those people are just happen to be more sensitive, and that could totally be a genetic thing, like what you're saying, like they have a genetic predisposition. And so where one person can drink 5 cups of coffee a day and then crash at night and get a solid 9 hours and feel amazing, someone else that does that is trashing their adrenals, and they end up in crazy HPA axis dysregulation, hormone imbalances, and all these other things.
Yep.
And a little bit of a difference could just be that you're slightly genetically different and you have to be a little more careful. But that doesn't mean that just because you can cram those 5 cups of coffee and sleep at night that you should be doing it, right?
Well, so that whole coffee thing, that's the COMT. So we can talk about that on another podcast.
Let's do it. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's my favorite gene of all times. But anyway, and you're absolutely right. And the way I explain it to patients is you have a toxic bucket. Like my 96-year-old grandmother never showed up in my office because she never filled up her toxic bucket. I hear time and time again, I have a 28-year-old or a 29-year-old or a 65-year-old that says, I felt great. I did great until X, until I got sick, until I got into a car accident, until I changed a job, until I got a vaccine. I mean, any number of these things, we all carry around this bucket, right? And every day we add to our level of toxicity. Some of us are better at getting rid of the toxicity than others. We call it the McDonald's quotient. How many times a week or month month do you eat at McDonald's? You know, if the answer is 0, you may fill up your toxic bucket less than if your number is 5. And so depending on when you fill up that toxic bucket is when you're going to express these symptoms of malhealth. And you're absolutely right. Everybody is different. And that is my biggest contentious point with conventional medicine, is that they try to stratify and unify the uniqueness and the bioindividuality that we see in this country, or in the world for that matter. Like all the antihypertensive medication that's out on the market, I think less than 1% of the studies is actually done on African Americans. You know, everybody needs to fall into these categories, which is why when you give African Americans ACE inhibitors, most of the time it doesn't lower their blood pressure. So, you know, when you're not looking at the population as a whole, or you're not looking at the biodiversity that we're seeing, you're certainly not going to get a true analysis of what everybody is tolerant of. And so, you know, I think that you have to be mindful of things. And that's why, you know, I always talk about like your inner intuition or your inner voice. Like you really have to listen to what's going to work for you. And, you know, a great example is B vitamins, right? People are positive for MTHFR, you got to give them B vitamins. So you give what you think is an appropriate dose, and you got somebody who thinks that they can leap tall buildings in a single bound, and you got somebody else who's vomiting with a migraine. You know, you have to really listen to what your patients are telling you and modify as such. And that, I think, was the biggest pitfall that happened when MTHFR first kind of hit the market, is everybody kind of touted themselves as these genetic specialists, and were just doling out tons and tons of methyl supplements, and people were getting really sick, and in some cases irreparably sick. And so I think that if you're not, you know, that's again where the beauty of naturopathic medicine is the unique bioindividuality of what you're doing. And, you know, I always say that to my husband. You know, he's a chiropractor, like he sees like 200 patients a day. He comes home, he feels so happy, he got people out of pain, he gets to adjust babies, and I come home and I'm like tired, and he's like, what are you so tired for? And I was like, I have to use my brain every day and really kind of reason through what these patients are telling me, and if they're even telling you the truth, because each and every patient that I spend time with is completely different. And so if you don't come from that approach, you're going to have a problem either as a patient or as a physician, I think.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I totally agree. Nobody is the same, and approaching it, you're always like, did I get everything? You know, did I listen to everything that they said? Did I miss something? Everybody's so different. But I love what you're saying about listening to your body, because, I really feel like, testing is amazing. And I do say test, don't guess. There are certain things that we need testing for. Like if you're having a ton of, GI symptoms, like we definitely want to look for parasites and bacteria and food sensitivities and all these things. Sure. But when it comes to food, sometimes, and you're talking about even supplements, listening to your body is so crucial. And sometimes that's the gold standard. I was, a friend mentioned the other day, she's like, hey, I've been like 2 weeks off gluten. I felt amazing. I got accidentally exposed the other day and I had a reaction, and I'm 99% sure that's what it is. But her husband, he wants like this medical correlation, and he wants a test, right? And I'm like, but your body's reaction is the gold standard in that case. Like you have to listen to it. If you're eating a food and having a reaction, I don't care if 20 tests come back and say you don't react to gluten. If you break out in hives, you react to gluten.
Well, exactly.
It's crazy. But listening to your body regardless, and being your own advocate, whether you're working with a naturopath or an MD or a functional medicine practitioner, whatever that is. But can you talk about, when you're talking about MTHFR and you're talking about the B vitamins versus the methylfolate and things like that, folic acid versus methylfolate, can you talk about the difference there? What would be some different approaches that you would take with clients? What would be the differences there?
Sure. So if you have patients that are real methyl sensitive, you can't give them methyl B vitamins, right? We know that the food for our cells is methyl B12, okay, or methylfolate. And so the way I always describe it is you can have the right stuff in the right place, all in the wrong location. So I always say to my patients, you're taking these B vitamins and you feel terrible. You got to stop taking the B vitamins, okay? So it's like you driving to the gas station and putting your car next to the pump and taking that gas pump and spraying the gasoline over the top of your car, right? You're at the right place at the right time to get the right thing, but the gasoline's in the wrong place. So what do you have? A big mess. And so that's how I describe what's going on with my patients that are methyl sensitive. So ultimately we all need B12 and we all need folate, period, end of story. So the tricks and the nuances come with how you're going to deliver that to the patient who's really super sensitive. So sometimes you give all the other B vitamins except for methylfolate and methyl B12 to kind of prime the body to get used to absorbing and tolerating B vitamins. Sometimes I use a bunch of minerals. Here in the Northeast, people are wildly mineral deficient. And so sometimes it's a matter of just having those cofactors present to be able to translate the B vitamins across the cell membrane a little bit more effectively. Sometimes if you use molybdenum or magnesium or vanadium or any number of other little micronutrients, they work almost like a lubricant, for lack of a better word, to get those Bs across the cell membrane a little bit more effectively. So you can get away with using lower quantities of B vitamins, so you don't make your patients feel real sick. Sometimes you use different forms. So you'll use a folinic acid as opposed to a methylfolate, or you'll use adenosyl B12 instead of methylcobalamin. And so it all depends, on the bioindividuality of that patient and what they can tolerate. Ultimately, we got to get the methylfolate and the methyl B12 in there. And so I've had patients in the past that are, like you said, full of parasites, full of bacteria. Their guts are super leaky. They're getting hives from absolutely everything they're eating. Their histamine levels are high. They feel like absolute crap. And so you're healing and sealing the gut. In the meantime, you're healing and sealing the brain. And then over time, you do things that kind of layer up a little bit. And so I'll never forget, I worked with a patient for 9 months. After 9 months, I got her to take 400 mics of folate twice a week. I mean, it was like the biggest victory we had, and we just needed to work very slowly and very deliberately with her because she had a lot of layers in her onion that we had to peel. And so you just have to kind of take it. Yeah.
And that, you started out talking about the difference between conventional medicine and functional medicine. And that's a huge one, I think, is the ability to be with your client through that process and to pull back the layers. Because more often than not, I think when you have a chronic illness of any kind, genetic or autoimmune, whatever it is, there's usually multiple layers that come out that you're like, okay, well, this cleared up and now this is showing up. And it's just a process, and it's good to remind clients that this probably took 10, 15, 20, 25 years to show up in your body. And like you were talking, that bucket of stress, it's not going to be fixed in a month. I mean, it's just not, we're so used to, well, let me take a prescription. It's a 7-day, 10-day antibiotic and I'm well, I'm good. Right. Yeah. But that's not actually how your body works. It's really good at healing itself, but it does take time.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Was there go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I just gave a lecture last week and we were talking exactly about this. And you can't come at patients with, you've got to make diet changes. You've got to make lifestyle changes. You've got to do all this. You got to do all that when they're sitting in the chair in your office and they can't even pick their head up off the table. And it's the same thing with their cells. Like you can't just front load their cells with everything they need because they need it. You have to gently work with them so they can make one deliberate change at a time with success. And every little piece of that success is another step closer to their healing.
I love that. So is there anything else you think people should know in terms of genetic testing or MTHFR specifically? I'd love to hear more on COMT.
Oh, COMT is my total favorite. So MTHFR, I will say this about MTHFR, there's about 8 billion genes in the genome, right? And there's about 8,000 of them that separate us from apes and about 800 of them that have implications on our health. And out of those 800, there's like 200 that we can change. Like we can't change the fact that you have blue eyes and that you're more sensitive to the sun than somebody with brown eyes. Those are still health, related genes. But there's about 200 genes that we can really look at. The beauty about MTHFR is, number one, it's part of the methylation pathway, and methylation is part of detox, and we all need to detox pretty effectively to be healthy. But it also was a real big gateway into us looking at what we're now calling precision medicine, right? At this place where we have our genes that, for the most part, aren't really going to change, that we have a huge opportunity to really help our own bodies heal. And, like we say in naturopathic medicine, we remove the obstacles to cure. So like something like COMT, if it's upregulated, creates issues with estrogen dominance. So if you're somebody who has an upregulated COMT and you're a vegan and you're eating all this soy, you can make a real easy change by removing soy from your diet, for example, or leaky gut and things like that. We can do things to just really help heal and seal the gut. And so those are the things that I think has been really effective as far as MTHFR goes. And as you know, I do a bit of infertility or fertility work as well. And MTHFR is huge with fertility. I mean, it can be the number one thing that is really impairing a couple from actually conceiving. So to be able to kind of take a real narrow and deep dive at that particular gene in those particular situations makes a huge difference for families. And so I think that's really where the beauty and the benefit lies. But really, I do think it's the tip of the iceberg, because you can have, 2 copies of MTHFR and live 96 years like my grandmother did without any issue. Or you could have no copies of MTHFR and have 5 other genes that are profoundly affecting your life.
Sure. So you were talking about MTHFR having to do with methylation and detox pathways. So beyond really zoning into the supplemental support, are there any other things that you work with your clients on in terms of helping their bodies detox to support that process?
So again, it's different for everybody, but for me, I tend to really lean in kind of a paleo diet type of lifestyle. I like whole foods, I like unprocessed foods, I like stuff that rots, that God made, that kind of a thing. For me personally,
stuff that rots, I love that.
I don't tolerate a lot of grains, so I have my own intentional bias around grains with my patients, especially with lectins and oxalates and things like that. So I tend to really lean toward a super whole foods kind of diet. I'm not a real supplement queen because, over the years I've seen, patients who would regularly and ritually take supplements that would make them feel sick. So I would much rather you find your own healing, within yourself and eat your medicine. And so I generally try to start with food and really only use supplements as a bridge to get over whatever hump you need because something is out of balance or deficient for that particular patient. I'm a huge advocate of exercise in the morning in particular, because it normalizes cortisol levels and peaks focus and metabolism. For patients who tolerate it, I very often will recommend saunas or Epsom salt baths or something to increase core body temperature, and not a super aggressive way, but enough to really irritate, parasites or Lyme disease or Epstein-Barr, things that are real heat intolerant. And I'm a huge advocate of minerals, whether it be through supplements or through your Brazil nuts or your almonds or whatever, because I do think that, we truly have everything that we need within us. It's just a matter of tapping into that intuition and figuring out which way with it.
Yeah.
And so I don't know that I have a real prescription because I'm always, I always say this to my patients, they wait 3 months to come in the office and I send them out of here with a healing diet and a probiotic. And I'm like, I'll see you in 3 months, after they waited all this time. But sometimes that's really all you need.
Yeah. And that's the thing too, is because I run some functional lab tests on people and everything. And it's you probably don't even want to come ask for a test from me if you have not changed your diet. Because first of all, that's what I'm going to ask you to do. So if you're not willing to do it, then don't bother getting tested. And secondly, for some people, that's all that it takes. And for a lot of people, it's not. There's some other stuff that needs to be addressed. But for some people, it's one simple change and boom, they feel amazing. I remember I had this client as a personal trainer. She came in and I was like, hey, I love to talk about food. What do you, all this kind of stuff. And she took me up on it. Now, some people do, some people don't. They don't want you to bother them about that, right? And so she was just super into it. She was like, tell me everything you know. What about this? What about this? What about this? So we actually didn't do any training that day. We talked for an hour about nutrition. She left. She applied it that night. Her boyfriend did as well. And both of them, within 1, maybe 2 months, had lost 20 to 30 pounds. Both of them. It was this overnight transformation from a few nutritional changes. And that was it. And I was like, guys, you're my poster children. Can I have
I know.
follow me around and just tell people this is amazing. But sometimes that's all it takes, I mean, it's just incredible. And it's amazing the power that food can have for good or bad.
You're not kidding. You're not kidding.
So there's a lot that we can do with our lifestyle, and there's a lot of lifestyle tweaks based on testing, based on your clinical knowledge, based on, lifestyle and environmental factors. But, when is there, when should people be aware of a time where blending maybe a prescription and lifestyle and nutrition? When does there come a point where, you need to sort of blend both worlds? Or is there? Have you run into that?
So again, like I said, I have the good fortune of seeing sometimes up to 3 generations of a family. So for example, when people bring in their young children, like say a baby that's still being breastfed, but that's walking and eating food, like maybe an 18-month-old or something like that. And they'll say, I know they have MTHFR because I do and my husband does. When do we start treating that child? And so in most cases, maybe around 2 years of age or when the child weans, you can start kind of looking at things. Maybe you do a little lab work at that point to see if their homocysteine is elevated and if the MTHFR has been turned on, or if they have a lip tie or a tongue tie that had to be resolved, something like that. So maybe at that point you want to start considering doing, a little bit of adjunct supplementation. But for the most part, what I do is I just, if I have the good fortune of seeing these families from when these babies are really young, you just instill these good habits in their household, so they're not eating gluten, they're not eating sugar, they're not eating processed foods. And so you can get a lot of your nutrients from the environment, itself. The other thing that sometimes happens is that, a quote insult occurs, something happens, they have to take an antibiotic or they have to take surgery. So sometimes after those sorts of incidents is when you'll need to support a body in a different way. Or even, death can be very stressful. Death of a spouse or family member can be very stressful, and that has huge implications on physical health. And so you're never sure what that tipping point is for your patient. And it could be anywhere from, 2 years old up to, 99. You just don't know when that's going to happen. So is there a drop dead point where I would recommend supplementation? Probably not. There might be a point where I would say, gee, let's do some testing. Or if a family comes back and says, gee, there's a new symptoms that's turned that I haven't noticed before. Like sometimes if for example, like if little boys are going to develop tics, they'll do it around 3 years old or around 8 years old. And so if that kind of stuff shows up, then maybe you want to do a little testing and see if that child requires some level of supplementation. As far as adults, I don't see, I unfortunately don't see a whole lot of healthy people. They don't start in here, healthy. They don't come in for prophylaxis. So what, I do see is exactly the scenario like we talked about. They've had a perfectly happy, healthy life, and then some incident has kind of backslid their health. And so if we can recover them from that incident and then move forward, a lot of times their health can be restored pretty quickly.
That's awesome. So share a little bit about your 2 books. We talked briefly about the one. Can you talk about your books a little bit and what they include and how they can help people?
Sure. So my first book was called The Delicious Way to Heal the Gut, and I wrote it for me. After my son was born, I had raging leaky gut. I'll send you the picture so you can put it up on your site. And I looked like I had dipped my arms and the upper part of my body into hot acid. I had the worst eczema I've ever seen in my entire life. And I was treating patients. My face was swollen. It was awful. And so I did every functional lab test that was out there that was, available to me, and not a single solitary thing came back positive that I could hang my hat on. Not a single solitary thing. So I did what I knew, which was I went to what I self-prescribed as the diet of 5 things. I literally ate 5 things for 3 weeks. And then every week I added another food in, and that it was just gut permeability and gut healing. So in that process, the whole process took almost a year for me to really restore my health. And I had just had a baby too. So I'm like still nursing this baby, running after the other baby I had. And so in that process, I basically, would modify all these recipes that I was cooking for my family and write them on sticky notes and stick them in my drawer because I knew what worked for me. And so when my son was about 4, my husband's like, why don't you put that in a book and save yourself 35 minutes of conversation with your patients, and they can just have basically a catalog of recipes. So that was the first book. And then a couple years later, I just basically simply published it on Amazon so I could use it as a resource in my office. And one of my patients happened to be a book publisher. And she said, your resource is amazing. She's like, but your book needs a little work, as far as context and pictures and things like that. So I drafted several, a couple more 100 recipes, did a similar type of book where the book, 100% of the recipes are gluten-free. And then they have dietary modifications for the anti-inflammatory diet, the SCD diet, the paleo diet, and I'm missing one. Hold on. Let me look. Sometimes I forget. Paleo diet, GAPS, SCD, and anti-inflammatory. There, whoop, anti-inflammatory, your favorite. And so all of the recipes are modifiable based on what you need, because as we know, healing is not linear, and what may work for you for a period of time may not work for you for the rest of your life. And so what do we all do? We go out and buy 50, paleo diet cookbooks, and then we decide we need an anti-inflammatory diet, because something's changed in our healing. So this book tends to be a really great resource that way. So it's been really fun. It's been really great to write. The pictures are really yummy. And even when I get stuck on recipes or, stuck on what I'm going to cook for dinner, I open my own cookbook and I'm like, oh, I haven't made that in a while. So, and that's what that book's about. And like I said, it was kind of a kitschy name because my husband just totally still makes me laugh after all this time, thinking about him in his white t-shirt and sweating about giving up balsamic vinegar. So,
That's too funny. That's too funny. Yeah. So what would you like to leave people with after they listen to this interview?
I would like to leave people with the fact that I think, we underestimate the power to heal ourselves, number one. Number two, I think that, any provider or practitioner you see is really your guide toward your own healing, but really healing is in your driver's seat. And always look, within you and to your environment first for healing. And then anything else can be very, very quickly cleared with supplements or procedures or whatever that, is much easier for the body to recover from. And I think it's a real simple message, more than anything else. And I think sometimes we forget about this in a world that just moves so rapidly.
Yeah. Awesome. I love that. So where can people connect with you? Where can they buy your books? Do you have a website? Where can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is drkendrabecker.com. I'm pretty simple. My office is in Waterford, Connecticut, if you want to come by and visit. My book is available on Amazon and through my website. And my blog is there and you can learn all about me. I am speaking at AAEM next week, which is in Denver, Colorado,
nice.
on genetics and vaccine susceptibility. So more genetics. We all love that. And so anybody that wants to come out and see us, or if you're from the Mile High City, come on by. I think my lecture's on Sunday. But yeah, so that's
Super
that.
Cool.
I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Are you going to be at PaleoFX in 2019?
Let's hope so.
I'm very excited to go. That's going to be my first PaleoFX, and I can't wait.
Awesome. Yeah, I just podcasted with those guys too about a month ago.
Oh, fantastic.
And I was waiting to hear back from them, but I haven't. So I think I'll drop them an email. They're pretty fun. That's such a go-getter kind of group.
That's awesome. I can't even wait. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your passion for epigenetics and how people can work on their nutrition and lifestyle, for giving them resources through your books as well that they can just grab and use and make some changes right away. But thank you so much for talking with us and being on the show.
Thank you so much, Kylene, for getting this message out. It's so important.